Today we're out at some OSU turf research plots, and joining me is Dr. Charles Fontanier with the Turf Grass Group. Tell us a little bit about some research, because some of this looks like turf grass, some of it looks a little non-traditional.
Right, so the OSU turf team spends a lot of its time working with traditional turf grasses like Bermuda grass, or in this case we have some buffalo grass on these plots. But we also acknowledge that there are other ground covers available that can serve as what we might call a turf in some ways. And so these lawn alternative plants have really been a growing interest area for us to kind of complement some of the conventional turf research we do.
So we have this idea that a front yard is supposed to be this monocropped, often Bermuda grass around here, lawn, right, that needs a lot of input and maintenance, but there is a shift going towards more pollinator, nectar plants, and maybe a little more low maintenance. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've selected here?
Yeah, so by far one of the top preferences is low input, and so that's definitely always something, but increasingly also looking at other ecosystem functions like servicing our pollinator insects with nectar resources. So we have at this location a particular group of plants, most commonly called Frogfruit.
Okay.
It has a number of other names you might see in the internet or commercial trade, and so some of those might include Lipia, you might see Carapia. We also sometimes see one called Turkey Tangle Fog Fruit. And so a lot of different names, but in general, it's a native plant, has tolerance to mowing and some traffic. And so it really fits that lawn alternative category very well for us. And in terms of its pollinator resources, it's particularly desirable because it has a really long window of flowering. And so it may not always be a pollinator's favorite flower, but it's around really in some of those times of year when other plants aren't available. And so has tremendous potential for us in that regard.
Okay, and so you've got your buffalo grass, it's sort of your controlled standard here.
Right.
And then you've got a couple of different varieties or types of
Right, so
Frogfruit?
When we're looking at what we call new plants, if you will, for different horticultural purposes, sometimes there are varieties on the market. Someone has developed an improvement or selected a certain flower color, but a lot of times it's also wild types. And so a lot of these lawn alternatives started off as maybe a weed species, and really that's a good start, because if it's a weed, it's pretty well adapted, usually hard to get rid of. And so if we can culture that and find something beneficial, that beats trying to control it all the time. And so we have here a local accession, a plant that we collected in Oklahoma. So that's truly a native version. And then we have two commercial varieties. One's called New Pink and one's called New White. And they're from a group out in California that is marketing out to that customer base already.
What are you seeing between those three selections of the Frogfruit?
Well, these were planted as plugs in April of this year, so that's been now about 3 months or so of growing, and we're seeing that the California or the varieties are a little more smaller plants, finer leaf texture, maybe not quite as fast as spreading to establish, but still very good and establishes readily. Put out quite a bit more flowers, I would say, than say the native variety, and maybe stays a little shorter thus far.
Okay, so there might be some appealing characteristics to that, but it might take a little longer to get coverage, right?
Right, maybe a little longer coverage, and really, the true test for some of these is, will it survive our winter? Will it survive our summer? And so we're looking at doing this over a couple of years, and maybe the California varieties do well, maybe one survives, maybe one doesn't, and we can learn from that and see if there's potential for our environment.
Okay, so and how are you kind of comparing that to the buffalo grass then?
Well, so we always feel the need to have something as a standard, and so you talked about these are supposed to be kind of low input, some drought resistance. And native, and so buffalo grass is kind of, I think, the natural fit, and so it's very capable of spreading and covering, and we saw that in this experiment. It was probably the fastest to spread, which is what we would normally expect, I think. And we'll watch it to see how it survives drought, how it comes out, and how green it is in spring or in fall, and try to compare it to something people know, right? Mm-hmm. So they have a good feel for what buffalo grass does. How do these plants compare, and some of those normal turf attributes they look for.
Obviously you had to get them established, but is there any maintenance that you're actually, or inputs that you're doing on it now that it's established? You're going to start mowing it, but are you fertilizing it or watering it at all?
So so great question. During establishment, we did use fertilizer just to kind of make sure we got a good establishment going. The plan is to shift now to have a couple different fertilizer regimes, one of those being no fertilizer once established, the other with kind of a moderate fertility, and one maybe a high fertility. And so we'll be able to see, does that impact mowing requirements? Does that impact flower intensity? So right now it is irrigated still, as we're still getting a few more to finish growing in. And once they're fully grown in, we'll also look at changing irrigation to having what we hopefully will have is a zero irrigated, and then one that's more of a typical, I'd say, set it and forget it type 1 inch per week program. Okay. And then, like you said, mowing, we haven't started mowing, but that's another piece. One of the big things about the pollinator services is it's not always about what plants you have as much as can we back off on mowing, and so can we mow taller, can we mow less often? That lowers the input level, but it also could help with the flowers and the pollinators there. So we'll look at some different mowing regimes. And
you said you have one native selection that you used here, and that just happened to be the one you kind of picked, I think, at the time. Are you looking at a bigger picture of maybe what's the best selection around the state here?
Sure. So Dr. Dennis Martin and I are working together on this project, and he's spent the last few years collecting quite a few frogfruit plants from around the state. And so he's kind of looked at them on his own over the last couple winters and summers to see what maybe survives and looks good. And so that's the one he kind of picked for us for this trial. But he's got 12 or 13 or so in another trial here on site where we're trying to do a little more refined comparison to see, okay, are there differences from these all frog fruit, all from Oklahoma? Can we find differences in how fast they grow, their flowering, survival, all those sort of things, and see, can we make it an improved selection from that group of plants as well?
So obviously, frog fruit is just one plant that somebody could use in a biodiverse lawn, right? You're not looking to switch a whole Bermuda grass lawn to a monocrop of frog fruit necessarily.
Right. So, in research, at least initially, we're trying to look at these frog fruit plants largely as a monostand, but that's just so we can get a baseline for what those plants are. Ideally, I think in many situations, folks will want to incorporate it into some sort of mixed sward that includes grasses and a variety of different flowering forbs. And certainly this has potential to fill a good spot in that mix simply because of its long flowering window and ability to spread and fill and do all those things that maybe some other plants that are maybe more bunch type, maybe have a shorter flowering window. This could kind of mesh well with some of those other species. Well,
Dr. Fontanier, thank you for sharing this with us, and it's great to see some of these biodiverse options that might be coming available.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and happy to share what we're doing here, and always looking out for the next Bermuda grass, but certainly also interested in trying to service as many areas of the turf industry as we can.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this video as part of our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. You can also find even more videos on the OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.